Hi everybody, this is Peter Schiff. It is Monday, July 9th, 2012. Well, on Friday, the government released the non-farm payrolls numbers, the jobs report, for the month of June. And once again, the numbers disappointed the overly optimistic economists on Wall Street in Washington who were looking for more robust numbers, although I think the consensus was 100,000, which is anything but robust anyway, although some economists have been looking for 150 to 170,000 jobs. Instead, we only created 80,000 new jobs. The unemployment rate held steady at 8.2%, although the only reason it didn't go up is because 34,000 more Americans threw in the towel. They left the labor force. They gave up because they couldn't find a job, and because they gave up, they're no longer counted as part of the official 8.2% unemployment rate. But at the unofficial unemployment rate, the U6 number, that notched up a tenth to 14.9%, almost 15% of Americans being unemployed, if you have a more accurate representation. Also, private sector job creation was the slowest in 10 months. Also, the first quarter, or the last quarter of 2012, the second quarter, is the slowest quarter for job creation in America since the first quarter of 2010. That's 2.5 years ago. So in other words, the employment picture is getting bleaker, not better. In fact, I think we are headed back to recession. Of course, I think we've been in a depression the entire time, although it was interrupted briefly by a bunch of stimulus that actually made the situation worse, which means the relapse is going to be worse than the initial disease. But unfortunately, none of these so-called doctors in Washington or at the Fed have any idea what they're doing. That's why we got to call them witch doctors, because the very stimulus is the source of our problem. I've been saying, for years that this recovery was phony, and the numbers are proving that. But you have to ask yourself this question. If this is a recovery, what's the next recession going to look like? This is as good as it gets during the boom times? We've just had this huge recovery, and the best we could get is the fact that more Americans filed for disability than got jobs, which is not only true for last month, but I think for the entire Obama administration. We have more people collecting disability checks than paychecks as far as the net increase is concerned. We're starting our next recession from here. We're starting a recession with rates at zero. I mean, how's the Fed going to cut rates when they're already at zero? Obviously, all we got is more quantitative easing. It's not going to be long before Operation Twist runs dry and the Fed is back to the well looking for more cheap money in the form of QE. In fact, last week we got announcements from the Bank of England that more QE is coming over there. The ECB, they cut rates from 1% to 75 basis points. So we got more money printing coming out of Europe. The amazing thing to me is how the markets reacted to all this on Friday. I understand why the stock market sold off. That makes sense. But gold sold off. Gold was down over 20 bucks, $25. Why sell gold? The dollar rose. Treasuries rose. Now, I can understand, though I disagree, with the dollar and treasuries being a safe haven if you're worried about Europe. But why should they be a safe haven if you're worried about America? We report weak economic data. That means we're likely to print more money. And so the trade is to buy the money we're about to print. People should have bought gold, but instead they bought treasuries. But again, as I said, it makes no sense. If you're worried about the debt in Europe, the last thing you'd want to do is buy debt in America. I mean, why would you want to loan money to the U.S. when we're less able to repay than Europe? So what investors really should have done, if they understood the real implication of those weak numbers, is that the prior stimulus hasn't worked, and so we're going to get more stimulus. But the only thing that stimulus does is destroy the value of money and inhibit the economy from actually recovering, which means it sets the foundation for yet more stimulus. So people should have bought gold. I think they will. But look at some of these other commodity prices. Everybody wants to focus on oil prices because oil prices were falling. Well, they were below 80. Now they're back above 85. But behind the scenes, while people were talking about the drop in oil prices, nobody was looking at the surge in wheat prices, in soybean prices, in corn prices. Take a look at these charts. You're talking about moves 25, 33, 40% moves in a month. These are huge breakouts in these commodities. This is not happening without inflation. And so we're seeing the results of all this money printing in these agricultural commodities. We're going to see it in energy again. I think oil prices are going to head back up, and I think they're going to head a lot higher, by the time the elections come around in the United States. And of course, food is the other part of food and energy that the government likes to exclude, when they calculate the core CPI. But of course, food and energy are the things that Americans buy the most, and the prices are the most apparent, and they take the biggest bite out of their paycheck. And so as we see more and more inflation, not only in America, but around the world, because central banks refuse to allow countries to heal, and instead they try to hide the symptoms beneath a Novocaine of monetary stimulus, ultimately the pain of inflation is going to be far greater than what the pain of recession would have been had the Fed or foreign central banks not involved themselves and allowed the markets to restructure economies and governments to force austerity where it counts. Whenever they talk about austerity, nobody ever focuses on who benefits. Yes, there are people who suffer from austerity, but there are people who are suffering now because we don't have austerity. The people who suffer during austerity are people who are living high on government paychecks. There are plenty of people who are getting paid a lot of money, but other people are being taxed to make that possible. Those are the people who are suffering, and real austerity will alleviate the suffering of the taxpayer, who is on the hook not only for these lavish benefits, but who's on the hook for all the debts that are being accumulated to finance these deficits, because the current tax rates are not high enough to pay for them. There's a lot of talk going on in the media right now about the fiscal cliff that we're supposedly headed for. And when they talk about the fiscal cliff, they're talking about the end of the year when the Bush-era tax cuts expire and these automatic spending cuts kick in. I mean, that's not my idea of a fiscal cliff at all. First of all, the spending cuts, the more the better. That's not a cliff, that's a blessing. The problem is there's not enough actual spending cuts to make a difference. Yes, the tax hikes are a problem, but I think the deficits are an even bigger problem. The real fiscal cliff is not the one everybody is looking for, but the one nobody is looking at, and that is what happens when interest rates rise. What happens when we're forced to pay a market rate of interest on the mountain of debt that we've already accumulated? That's the fiscal cliff. And what about when we have to choose between default or runaway inflation? That's a cliff. I mean, what we're looking at now, maybe you could describe it as a fiscal pothole, but there's no way you can call it a cliff. But believe me, we are headed for a real cliff. In fact, I just wrote a commentary that should be up on the internet today entitled The Real Fiscal Cliff, and I've put my thoughts into words, so you can read that up on the Europac website, or a lot of other websites tend to carry my commentary, so you can read it at various places. But that's the fiscal cliff that they went over in Europe. Why is the debt such a big problem? It's because rates have risen. They're talking right now about the rates in Spain up at 7%, in Italy at 6%. People are wondering, how much longer can the Spanish afford to pay 7%? It's the escalation in the rate of interest that is the cause of the concern. Well, remember, a few years ago, these nations were just as broke, but it wasn't problematic because the rates were at record lows. Well, the same situation is true in America. Our rates are at zero. But what happens when they're 6% or 7%? Can our economy weather that type of interest rate? Can it hold up any better than Spain or any better than Italy? No, in fact, I think we're worse positioned. Everybody just falls back on the idea that, well, it's never going to happen. Interest rates are never going to rise. Yeah, I've seen that movie before with real estate. Oh, real estate prices will never fall. They'll always go up. Well, they were wrong. Well, the idea that interest rates will always stay low, that the Fed can always keep interest rates low, is false. If central banks could always keep interest rates low, well, they would never rise anywhere. Now, people might say, well, the difference is we can print money, but some of these European countries can't. Well, look, Zimbabwe can print money. It didn't stop interest rates from rising there. Argentina can print money. In fact, printing money doesn't stop interest rates from rising. In fact, if you want to look at countries historically that have had the highest interest rates, it's the ones that can print money. The one thing that some of these countries have going for them is that they can't print money, and so they might have to do the right thing instead of printing money. But in America, we think that we've got an ace in the hole. We can print money. I said this on a CNN show recently. If you live by the printing press, you die by the printing press. This is not our ace in the hole. It's our Achilles heel. It is the most dangerous part of our economy because default through inflation is worse than default through restructuring. Which brings me to Obama's speech today. Based on the horrific jobs numbers on Friday and Obama's constant attempts to make economic lemonade out of the lemons, he did a press conference today, and his solution is that we extend the Bush tax cuts for another year to everybody who makes less than $250,000. They're all households that makes less than $250,000. Well, first of all, that's the tax code we got now. If we have a lousy economy and it can't create jobs, how is extending the current tax code for another year going to change the situation? In fact, we're not even extending the current code. We're making it worse in that we're going to be raising taxes on the very people that we hope to create the jobs. And of course, President Obama is trying to spin this into the fact that these higher taxes, and the taxes that are going to go way up, by the way, on the job creators, on the investors, on the savers, that somehow this is not going to hurt the economy. In fact, President Obama is saying that cutting taxes on high-income earners is the worst way to grow the economy because they don't spend all of their money. Precisely. It's because they don't spend all their money that they help grow the economy. The president thinks economies grow because you spend. He's got to read how an economy grows and why it crashes. Economies grow because people don't spend. It's because they save. We don't have a lack of spending in America. We have an abundance of that. We have a lack of savings. That's why we don't invest enough. That's why we don't produce enough. That's why we don't have the productive jobs that we need. No, in fact, the president even characterizes tax cuts or preserving the current tax brackets for high-income earners as spending money. If you listen to the speech, he said the government can't afford to spend money on tax cuts. Well, maybe the president doesn't understand the definition of the word spending. See, spending is when you take money that you have and then you spend it. Right? When you take money away from people, that's not spending, that's taxing. Although I guess, Obama doesn't understand the concept of taxation either, which is obvious from the recent Supreme Court decision over the tax penalties in the Affordable Care Act. But I already went over that in my last video blog. But of course, it's not spending when you let people keep their money. Spending is when after you've already taken money away from people who have earned it, and then you spend it by giving it to people who didn't earn it. If people get to keep their money, that's not spending, that's freedom, that's liberty. And what Obama wants is less of that. But of course, he says that it's not going to hurt businesses, because according to President Obama, 97% of small businesses, the owners are earning less than $250,000, and so they're not going to be impacted by higher interest rate, by higher taxes. Well, who does President Obama think those small business owners go to when they need capital? If they need to borrow money, if they need an investor to buy equity in their businesses so that they can buy new equipment, so that they can expand, so they can hire people, where do they go? They go to the people whose taxes are being raised. And by definition, if the government is going to take more money away from the high-income earners, the savers, the investors, there's less investment capital. That means it's going to be harder for small businesses to expand. And if they want to expand, they're going to have to pay a higher rate of interest or give up a bigger equity stake in their business to attract the capital to make up for the extra return. After all, a lot of high-income earners, well, they'll just simply buy muni bonds. If you keep raising the taxes on what they can earn on private loans or from an equity investment, they might just buy muni bonds, which is great for municipalities so that they can pay more money to their unionized workforces. But how is that going to benefit the economy? How is that going to benefit these small businesses by starving them of capital? See, President Obama can't connect the dots. He doesn't see the unintended consequences. The very idea that we can grow the economy by taking money away from investors, entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, the type of people who are funding businesses, that we can deprive them of their capital and we can send it to Washington instead. And somehow this transfer is going to improve the economy. It's going to lead to a higher standard of living. It's going to lead to more production. It's going to lead to more jobs. It's just ridiculous. There is no precedent for it working. The best way to generate real wealth and real jobs is through the private sector, to have individuals allocating capital based on their own incentives to make a profit. And the more you diminish the pool of capital, then the more you diminish opportunity for everybody. And that's all you're doing. And of course, as the government raised taxes higher and higher, more people are now focused on ways to minimize their taxes as opposed to maximizing their income. And we don't want that. We want people finding out how to use their wealth to grow the economy, not try to hide it and protect it from confiscation, which is all that happens when you raise taxes. And of course, when it doesn't work, when these higher taxes backfire, what's going to happen? The economy is going to get worse, and they're going to say, well, we need even higher taxes. President Obama is going back to the Clinton era and saying, well, all I want to do is raise taxes back to where they were when Clinton was president, because he says we had a great economy under Clinton and we had higher taxes, therefore it's the higher taxes that gave us the great economy. Well, the president doesn't understand logic, because you can't draw a conclusion from those two unrelated elements. In fact, it's very easy to argue that maybe we would have had a better economy under Clinton if the tax rates had been lower. In fact, I know we would have if we had a much smaller government. But part of the problem in the Clinton era was because we inflated a stock market bubble, and we were living off the phony wealth associated with that bubble. And we also began a housing bubble during the Clinton era. It started, I think the bubble started really in 96, 97. So Clinton was president for the beginning of the housing bubble, and some of the artificial boost that gave to the economy during his second term. Of course, when Bush inherited that mess, the stock market bubble burst at the beginning of his term, and the housing bubble burst at the end. But really what gave us some of that supposed prosperity in the 90s was bubbles inflated by the Fed. So is that really what Obama thinks we need now? Well, probably. I don't even want to answer that question. It's probably better left rhetorical. But yeah, we had a phony economy. We don't want to go back to that, because that's what produced the collapse of 08-09. In fact, the president likes to blame, and he did in his speech, he says we tried lower taxes on the rich and less regulation, and that's what produced the financial crisis and the Great Recession. No, it's not. That's not what produced it. What produced it is the bad monetary and fiscal policies of the 1990s that the president wants to go back to. That's what produced it. What we need is legitimate return to free market capitalism. We need a real contraction of government. We need honest money. We need higher interest rates. We need to take a meat hook to the federal budget, not just these tiny little cuts that are going to kick in at the end of the year, which unfortunately we're probably not even going to get. I mean, all these promised cuts, that were part of that deal to raise the debt ceiling, and they promised cuts over 10 years, they're not even going to hold up their end of the bargain for the first year. I mean, and yet they're going to promise cuts 10 years from now with a straight face? Yeah, I mean, who can believe that? Unfortunately, the laugh is going to be on us. Don't forget, if you want more frequent updates on the goings-on Wall Street or in Washington, don't forget to listen daily to my radio show. You can listen at schiffradio.com, 2 hours a day, every weekday, 10 a.m. to noon Eastern Time. Also, my new book, The Real Crash, America's Coming Bankruptcy, How to Save Yourself and Your Future, is available. It's on the bookstores. You can buy it online. It's selling pretty well. If you haven't already purchased a copy, pick one up. In fact, if you have a copy, buy another one. I'm sure you have a friend that can benefit from reading it. Take care and bye for now.